Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Today, we're focusing on weeds as you prepare for spring work. And we've got, of course, Dr. Alyssa Essman, our Weed Science Extension Specialist with OSU. Alyssa, we've had you on a few times before, and you do your own podcast on weeds. So between that and the core newsletter, a lot of information out there, but we always like to have you on to go over some of this stuff and a little bit different perspective, I guess, on our podcast here. So I think what we'll start out with is maybe just the top weeds that farmers should be concerned with this spring.
Great to be back with you guys. Thanks for having me. We can kind of talk a little bit about our survey, and I know county educators do a survey, and that kind of gives us a snapshot of what weeds we have. And based on, what we saw last year, we can kind of how well our herbicide programs worked and also kind of understand the issues we're going to be facing next year based on what we saw end of season. So somewhat unsurprisingly, but very concerning, we saw waterhemp was actually our number one weed species in 2024 across the state in terms of frequency. So of all the 10 weed species we evaluated, it was the number one in terms of most common. So that's something we're definitely keeping an eye on and discussing, how we manage water hemp and how it's different than some of the other weeds we're used to facing. After that, giant ragweed, which not a huge surprise, but one of those weeds that's just really troublesome, and we see it year after year as being just a really big problem. After giant ragweed, we had our grass and foxtail species, which again are kind of that classification that's creeping up year after year in terms of the frequency we're seeing it in terms of escapes. And then we have a weed we call it a weed, but it's also kind of a crop, right? Volunteer corn, which I know has also in the educator survey been kind of near the top of the list in terms of frequency at end of season. And we kind of round out our top 5 in terms of most common weeds with mare's tail or horseweed, one that just is really difficult to control in our no-till system.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially, seeing water hemp take over in Ohio, and I mean, even some of the others. Was there anything, I know we've talked about this, so I kind of know the answer, but could you discuss a little bit about what made the 2024 season just so challenging for trying to control those weeds? Like water hemp, you would think in a drought year would be less of an issue, but that wasn't the case.
Yeah, it was an interesting year. We kind of had a flux of different weather patterns. I think in the spring we were super wet and maybe caused some issues with some of our residuals maybe getting too much precipitation. But the big concern last summer, obviously in Ohio, especially in different pockets of the state as we get into Southeast Ohio in different areas, was the drought, right? And so where we had some of those later applied residuals, just little to no precipitation to get those incorporated into our soils to be effective, to have good control. And we know water hemp has a really different emergence pattern than a lot of other weed species, right? It tends to come up later in the growing season. So we're not always hitting it with our burn down, right? It's that residual component in the burn down that we're getting the water hemp with. But as it continued to emerge throughout the season, we just might not have had the activation of those residual herbicides we would have liked to have had because of those really drought-like conditions. And so could have been one of those situations that led to some less than ideal late season control and us seeing more in field.
Does any of that change how we should be thinking about weed control going into 2025?
Yeah. So one of the hard things with, weed control and crop production in general is really, if we had a crystal ball, it'd all be so much clearer, right? But kind of where we're at now in 2025, we know we had water hemp in really high numbers in terms of frequency. So it's one of those we expect to see maybe in higher numbers again this year, just based on the populations that we had in field at the end of the season last year, knowing, how many seeds each of those plants produce. And so we can have anywhere from 100,000 to 1 million seeds per plant on any of those left in field late season. So I think as we have been, continuing to make water hemp a priority, knowing these characteristics of, seed production, this really fast growth rate, long emergence window, and really high genetic diversity, continuing to prioritize that into this growing season, I think will be really important. One of the struggles with doing so this year is crop prices are pretty low, and some of the management strategies we talk about, especially when we get into these really comprehensive residual programs for something like water hemp, can get kind of pricey. And so one of the things we've been talking about is, what are some of those considerations that influence weed management, but also kind of on a operation scale? What are some things we can do to help us manage water hemp in maybe a cost-effective manner? One thing with water hemp that we say with all weeds, but it's especially true, with this weed, is that we want to get them before they emerge. So that's why we, rely so heavily on these residual herbicides. We know once they're out of the ground, they've got a really fast growth rate. Our spring weather patterns are really unpredictable. And so if we miss them at a time when they're at an appropriate height, it's harder and harder to kill those plants the more growing points they put on, right? So getting them with our residuals, knowing it takes a full rate in multiple sites of action, is the best strategy. One thing we really don't want to do in these situations where prices are low is to kind of cut back the diversity or the rates in our herbicide program, right? Those are the factors that are going to give us that effective control. And obviously this is a weed scientist perspective, but I think there are other things we're throwing in those tank mixes sometimes that we can cut back on in situations like this that maybe don't have such a direct implication for yield, right? So we're not really wanting to make cuts that we're going to jeopardize yield or jeopardize weed control, knowing that will just increase our costs down the road, right? So some things we can do, a lot of these premix options have really good generic comparables, right? So using those generics and making our own premixes is one way to kind of cut back on the costs associated with managing something like water hemp. And along those lines, we talk a lot about water hemp, but one question that can come up is, maybe I don't have water hemp, maybe that's not my problem driver weed in my operation or in a couple fields. And so, knowing your weed problems in each field and prioritizing management on what's actually there on a field by field basis can help you cut some of those costs and making sure we're getting really strategic and targeted applications. And that will have kind of the most implications for long-term profitability, right? To help us through kind of these tough times.
Yeah, that's something I always like to push when I'm teaching pesticide recertification, because it doesn't mean you have to apply it to all your acres. It does mean that you have to have a pretty good idea of what's in each of your fields, but not every field is the same. So maybe you need to spend a little bit more or make a second post on a couple fields, and it may not be the same for all those fields. And that's where you can budget a little bit better if you know each field individually.
Yep, exactly. And that it's these sort of situations where scouting and identification become really important. Like you mentioned, knowing what's in your field, being able to identify, little differences even in our pigweed populations that have different, levels of economic concern. And that's kind of where we can come in, right? If you have a weed population and you're not quite sure what it is or how to manage it, you can always, reach out to one of us and get that ID and get that help in making a management plan. But that's exactly right. Knowing what's in your field and the differences between them can help you be more targeted and make that money go further for your weed management program.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about some of those residuals because they are such an important part of water hemp management. What do you recommend there? There's some different options within that group 15, but they're maybe not all as effective.
Yeah, so I guess just to clarify, in our soybean program, our only option for a residual post-emergence is group 15. And along those lines, that group 15 really is one of the most effective kind of classes of herbicides that we have for the management of water hemp. Within that, there's a number of different options with different levels of efficacy. Kind of at the very top of the list in some of our trials and trials across the Midwest is a pyroxasulfone or a Zidua type product. Residuals present differently than post-emergence, right? In a post-emergence application, you have a plant, you apply a foliar product, and either it dies or it doesn't, right? And maybe if it doesn't die, could be, some sort of application situation with concern or resistance. But residual herbicides, when we talk about efficacy and resistance, it's really the length of control that we're concerned with. And so this pyroxasulfone, or the component Insidua, has that really long effective window that gives us the best control for water hemp. That being said, one of the concerns when we talk about water hemp management is this reliance on our group 15s, right? We know how herbicide resistance develops, and if we're continually going back to this class of herbicides, that's a situation where we're putting a lot of selection pressure on those herbicides. And we know in some other states, they've already seen with a couple different species and different group 15 herbicides, a real reduction in efficacy. So this is where we want to, making sure we're having that diversity in our herbicide program. And so some other effective options are our group 14 herbicides and group 5, right? For soybean, some other really effective options are flumioxazin and sulfentrazone. Metolachlor is as metolachlor and dual is a more cost-effective option, and it has pretty good control. Other group 15s like acetochlor or warrant and outlook provide some control, but they don't, again, have that length of residual that we'd like to see out of something like Zidua, right? But when we talk about this reliance on our group 15s, once we get to the post situation, again, that's really our only option. And what we, suggest as the best control process, based on this long emergence window, is what we call an overlapping residual strategy. So we make our initial application of a residual in the spring, and as soon as we apply it, right, when those herbicides are exposed to sunlight or a lot of high moisture and warmth, they start to break down, right? And they break down in the soil over time until they reach a concentration that doesn't have an effect any longer on our water hemp. So by applying a residual in our post application and bumping that concentration of a product in the soil back up to an effective level, that gives us that long period of control to cover the length of water hemp emergence until that crop can really get some growth and vigor and really shade out and compete with those water hemp populations. So one strategy in this that might be beneficial when we think about rotating and mixing our residual products is to potentially use something like a group 14 and a group 5 up front and save that 15 for that post-emergence application, knowing, again, that's our class that we have as an option post, right? So something like flumioxazin and metribuzin up front, and then saving maybe a Zidua type product for the post can be a good strategy. And here we can talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing, and really this group of extension weed scientists across the Midwest has been doing, looking at metribuzin as a really great tank mix option for water hemp control. It is, again, it's an older product, but it is more cost effective, and we think has a really good fit when it comes to tank mixes for water hemp management. The concern here, of course, anytime we talk about metribuzin, is this risk of injury, right? We know, especially in certain environmental conditions, if we have high pH soils, our organic matter has an influence, right? But in certain situations, we have injury. So basically, we put out a series of trials over the past several years looking at first rates of metribuzin, anywhere from 4 to 16 ounces. We looked at different tank mix options, and now we've transitioned into a project that OSU is leading. One of my grad students is responsible for is metribuzin in an early planted soybean situation. Early planted soybeans, again, one of those trends we're seeing in agriculture. We know that yield bump potential as we push planting dates earlier. Well, how does this metribuzin kind of interplay in those situations where we might have more cold, wet soils earlier in the season, knowing we do have this risk of injury, right? And I can say from, again, those 3 trials across about 10 to 12 states in any given year, we've seen really, really excellent control with metribuzin with a pretty minimal injury, right? When we get to that 10 to 12 ounce range, that's where we really see, excellent control, minimal injury. And it's a really great tank mix option with something like flumioxazin and pyroxasulfone. We saw pretty excellent control with that application. Another concern here that comes up is, of course, resistance. One thing we've seen and other states in our region have seen is triazine resistant water hemp populations. One thing that's been really interesting about this and will likely end up changing how we talk about herbicide resistance in general is that, our triazine herbicides include things like atrazine, simazine, and metribuzin. But when we look at the differences between these herbicides, right, our symmetrical triazines, atrazine and simazine, we've seen a lot of resistance and a real reduction in efficacy of those herbicides in several of our water hemp populations. Metribuzin, however, is an asymmetrical triazine. So based on this different structure in the chemical compound, we have seen really little to no resistance to metribuzin. And we think, it really has a place for water hemp control in this situation, being a more cost-effective option with low injury. And I should mention, in talking about this injury, part of this trial, we tried to include different soybean varieties, knowing that, companies historically have screened for injury from things like metribuzin and sulfentrazone. And a number of states had such a hard time finding a sensitive variety that we just replaced it with a different factor that we looked at. And so maybe this is one of those situations where over time our soybean varieties have potentially, gotten more tolerant to metribuzin as well, and could be contributing to this reduced injury that we're seeing, maybe compared to what we would have expected many years ago, right? But these are some of the things that, as we think about management of water hemp and making it cost effective, especially for those residual components, that I think can be helpful going into this season.
I always really appreciate having you here because I think the hallmark of a really great specialist is after listening to you talk about this, I feel very confident in my ability to control these weeds, even though I'm still going to have to call you with questions. But I think you just do such an amazing job of explaining things and being really clear about, the strategies that can work. So again, I really appreciate that. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about what appears to be becoming the reality star of herbicides, always caught up in some kind of drama. And everybody knows I'm talking about dicamba. So again, dicamba's made its way into the news. And could you just give us a rundown of the latest on that going into the spring?
Yeah, great question. I appreciate the kind words, and I feel the same about you guys. I think we've got a really great team here at Ohio State. Yeah, dicamba's back in the news. So, kind of history. Last February, the registration for the 3 dicamba products that were labeled for over-the-top application in soybean, XtendiMax, Ingenia, and Tavium, were vacated, right? And basically, what happened was when those went through, they were products that had been used, but the EPA said because they were a new use, now being over the top, they had to go through a comment period, and they did not do that. So the registration has been vacated. EPA did end up coming back shortly after that and issuing what they called an existing stocks order. That meant for the last growing season, especially knowing, growers had pretty much already purchased or planned for their weed management and seed programs for that year. Growers in last growing season 2024 were allowed to use the dicamba that had already been purchased up through the final application date, which was June 30th of last year. So as it stands at this time of recording, right, going into the 2025 growing season, we don't have any labeled dicamba options for post-emergence application in dicamba resistant soybean, right? And what that means is if we're using the XtendFlex system and we want to put down a dicamba product pre-emergence, we still have to follow those cutoff dates on the label prior to planting. And it also means we don't have any dicamba products as a post-emergence option in those dicamba tolerant soybeans. So again, if we're using XtendFlex, our post options really are a glufosinate product. We still have glyphosate and we still have PPO inhibitors in any soybean system, right? And the last I checked the website, it looked like Bayer at least had submitted for registration of a dicamba product, and I'm not sure that has been looked at or processed in any way. So as it stands right now, I think the plan is to not rely on having a dicamba product post emergence in soybean.
Well, Alyssa, you provided a lot of information, a lot of considerations this spring. We had an interesting year last year with the wet and the dry. We've had a pretty wet winter these last couple of months, it seems like, to restore some of that soil moisture, but we're still up in the air on what this growing season will bring. I think just to recap a little bit of what you shared, considering field by field options, water hemp is still going to be the number one weed that we probably need to look out for. You'd agree with that?
Yep.
And so there's some opportunity for cost savings to maybe use some generics and make your own mixes. You mentioned using metribuzin. That could be very effective option there too, and trying to provide some support for those group 15s so we don't develop resistance there.
Yep.
Anything?
Yeah, and I will say on a positive note, before we log off here, we have seen this shift to the Enlist system. So we do still have some pretty comprehensive post options for control, knowing that the best post strategy for water hemp is a combination of 2,4-D and glufosinate with that group 15 herbicide post.
Yeah, that's great. We didn't really have time to dive into the post today. But like I said before, they can find your information in a number of places. Do you want to share those?
Sure, yeah. I can be reached at any time. My email is Essman, ESSMAN.42@osu.edu. We also have a webpage, osu.edu/OSU Weeds, and we can be found across all social media sites at Ohio State Weeds.
So thanks again for your time, and we look forward to seeing what research you have in the works this coming growing season.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Join us again in 2 weeks for our next episode.
Hey, podcast listeners. Just a reminder to give us a like or subscribe so you know when we release new episodes. If you're enjoying the podcast, be sure to leave us a review also. We appreciate the comments.